Good morning. A quorum being present, the Subcommittee on National Security and Foreign Affairs, the hearing entitled Rethinking Our Defense Budget, Achieving National Security Through Sustainable Spending, will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that only the chairman and ranking members of the subcommittee be allowed to make opening statements. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that Congressman Barney Frank and Congressman Ron Paul be allowed to participate in this hearing if they are able to attend. In accordance with committee rules, they'll only be allowed to question the witnesses after all official members of the subcommittee have first had their turn. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the hearing record be kept open for 5 business days so that all members of the subcommittee will be allowed to submit a written statement for the record. Again, without objection, so ordered. Once again, good morning, and thank our witnesses for being here this morning to assist us. Today, the subcommittee continues its oversight of spending of the Department of Defense. Specifically, we'll examine recommendations from a number of defense experts for ways that we can reduce defense spending while ensuring that our national security interests are not compromised. Over the last 2 Congresses, this subcommittee has devoted significant time and resources to oversight of defense spending. We have examined the defense acquisitions process and have worked to ensure that adequate planning and testing is completed before multi-billion-dollar weapon systems were purchased. We have investigated contracting in our overseas military operations and discovered widespread waste, lack of management, and blindness to broader security implications of these problems. We have looked closely at the Missile Defense Agency, military aid programs, and strategic planning for new technologies such as the unmanned aerial vehicles. We continue to try to get a clear picture from the Department of the actual number of overseas military bases we have, as well as the strategic rationale for each location. Time and again, we see opportunities for increased efficiency, less waste, and better use of taxpayer money. Just 2 weeks before President Obama was sworn into office in January of 2009, the Congressional Budget Office announced that the fiscal year deficit was estimated at over $1 trillion. The inauguration occurred with an anticipated estimated long-range deficit of $11.5 trillion. In February of this year, President Obama established a bipartisan National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. This commission has been tasked with finding ways to improve the long-term fiscal outlook of the United States. It is critical that the Commission scrutinize all aspects of our budget, including the defense budget as it formulates its suggestions. I hope, in fact, that members of the Commission will pay close attention to our discussion here today, and in fact, I'm scheduled to meet with the Commission's co-chairs tomorrow afternoon, at which time I intend to urge them to do just that. Today, we will consider options for realigning our national defense spending. We have with us a panel of experts from diverse political viewpoints who will speak about ways that they and others who work with them on the related report believe we can cut the defense budget while maintaining our commitment to national security. 2 of our witnesses are members of the Sustainable Defense Task Force, which has recently released that report with recommendations that, if implemented, would reduce the department budget by some $960 billion by the year 2020. Neither I nor the individual members of the subcommittee are bound to agree with each and every recommendation made by the report or in the testimony today, yet most of the members would, I believe, welcome consideration of the topic and a number of the individual suggestions that are proffered. We look forward to the discussion of those recommendations as well as any additional suggestions from our panel. To be absolutely clear, this discussion should not be dismissed, as it may be by some, as an attempt to weaken the Department of Defense or under-prioritize United States national security. As this subcommittee's track record demonstrates, every member of this panel takes the security of our country very seriously. Waste is waste, regardless of the context, and inefficiencies only hurt our ability to respond effectively to crisis and promote our national security interests. Should national security in an austere budget environment, sound national security in an austere budget environment require strategic choices and rational resource allocation. Bigger is not always better, especially in matters of national defense. Budgets always involve hard choices, but in this case, these choices can be made and make our nation stronger. It is through that lens that we approach our conversation today. It's our duty on this subcommittee and in the Congress as a whole to make certain that taxpayer money is spent responsibly. As President Obama has said, quote, "We have an obligation to future generations to address our long-term structural deficits which threaten to hobble our economy and leave our children and grandchildren with a mountain of debt," close quote. The critical importance of our national security does not in any way exempt the Defense Department from its obligations to spend money wisely and efficiently. With that, I'd like to recognize Mr. Flake for his opening comments.
I thank the chairman and thank the witnesses for coming in. As the chairman noted, every member of this panel takes the defense of our country seriously, but we also recognize that we have a huge problem in terms of debt and deficit. and savings cannot be simply gained in entitlement programs or other discretionary programs. It has to be gained here as well. Since 2001, as is noted, nearly 65% of the increase in discretionary spending has come in defense, and we need to make sure that we're spending taxpayer money wisely, and that's the purpose of this hearing, and I hope we're enlightened by what you have to say, and thank you for your preparation, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Flake. So the subcommittee will now receive testimony from the witness panel before us today, and before we start, I'll introduce all of you, and then we'll begin going from my left to right. Dr. Carl Canetter is the co-director of the Commonwealth Institute's Project on Defense Alternatives, the PDA. Since co-founding PDA in 1991, Dr. Canetter has authored and co-authored over 30 PDA reports and has published widely outside the Institute, including contributions to 10 edited volumes. Dr. Canetter also recently served as a member of the Sustainable Defense Task Force, and in this capacity contributed to the task force report entitled Debt, Deficits in Defense, A Way Forward, which represents a series of recommendations to reduce the budget of the Department of Defense by $960 billion. Dr. Canetter has appeared extensively before Congress, the executive branch, and other governmental and non-governmental institutions, and has been interviewed by a range of major media outlets. He has also served as a consultant for the Council on Foreign Relations, the House Armed Services Committee, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Before joining PDA, Dr. Canetter was a fellow at the Institute for Defense and Disarmament Studies, served as an editor of the South End Press, and taught for 2 years at the University of Connecticut. Mr. Benjamin Friedman is a research fellow in Defense and Homeland Security Studies at the Cato Institute. He also served recently with Dr. Canetter as a member of the Sustainable Defense Task Force and contributed to the report. Mr. Friedman's areas of expertise include counterterrorism, homeland security, and defense politics with a focus on threat perception. He is co-editor of a book on United States military innovation since the Cold War, and his work has appeared in Foreign Policy, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Baltimore Sun, WashingtonPost.com, Defense News, and several other newspapers and journals. Mr. Friedman holds a BA from Dartmouth College and is a PhD candidate in political science and an affiliate of the Security Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Todd Harrison is the Senior Fellow for Defense Budget Studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He joined the Center in 2009 from Booz Allen Hamilton, where he supported clients across the Department of Defense, assessing challenges to modernization initiatives and evaluating the performance of acquisition programs. He previously worked in the aerospace industry, developing advanced space systems and technology, and served as a captain in the United States Air Force Reserves. Since joining the Center, Mr. Harrison has authored a number of publications, including analysis of the fiscal year 2010 and fiscal year 2011 defense budget request and impact of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan on the United States military's plans, programs, and budgets. He holds a BS and an MS in Aeronautics and Astronautics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Gary Schmidt is a resident scholar and director of the American Enterprise Institute's program on Advanced Strategic Studies. His work focuses on long-term strategic issues that he believes affect America's security at home and its ability to lead abroad. Dr. Schmidt previously served as the staff director of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and as the executive director of President Ronald Reagan's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. In addition, Mr. Schmidt has served as the executive director at the Project for the New American Century, as a consultant to the Department of Defense, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, and as a member of the research faculty at the University of Virginia. Dr. Schmidt has co-authored and edited several books and has published widely for scholarly journals, volumes, and newspapers in the areas of national security, foreign policy, and the American presidency. He holds a BA from the University of Dallas and earned his PhD from the University of Chicago. And Dr. Gordon Adams is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and a professor of United States foreign policy at American University. Prior to that, he was the director of Security Policy Studies program at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He also previously served as the Deputy Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London and as the Associate Director for National Security and International Affairs at the Office of Management and Budget as a Senior White House Budget Official for National Security. He has been an International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and received the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service. Mr. Adams has published books, monographs, and articles and has testified numerous times before Congress on defense spending and national security issues. He received his PhD in political science from Columbia University and graduated magna cum laude from Stanford University. So again, I want to thank all of you for making yourselves available today and for sharing your substantial expertise. It is the policy of this committee to swear you in before you testify, so I ask you to please stand and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record will please reflect that all of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I remind all of you that your full written testimony will be submitted in the record and incorporated in it. We've allocated 5 minutes for each of you to give us an opening statement, synopsizing your comments if you would. The red light is the one to let you know that your time is up. About a minute before then, it'll turn amber, giving you a fair warning. For the first 4 minutes, you got a green light going. So we're happy to do that. We're anxious to get to the point where we can have an exchange. And so we invite your testimony, starting with Dr. Canetta, please.
Chairman Tierney, Congressman Flake, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear here today before you to discuss how we might put our security posture on a sustainable basis. I want to begin with a slight correction. Though my parents would be delighted, I'm afraid that it's Mr., not Doctor. All of the doctors we've sent to the other end of the table.
We periodically agree to award degrees, but we'll forego it.
You have the report of Sustainable Defense Task Force before you, I hope. I was one of the authors of that. We've recently prepared a short one-page summary. You might also have that before you. There are a number of proposals outlined there. I'm not going to examine them in detail. Maybe we'll get into that during the question period. There's quite a bit there that's controversial. The proposals need your scrutiny, they need your criticism, and we can go into detail during the question period. What I would like to do is say something about the concerns and the criteria that we used in developing those proposals. We began our work with the recognition that today's financial crisis and Great Recession have altered the context in which all federal policy must be assessed. For the formulation of security policy, there are now 3 relevant reference points. 11/9/1989, that's when the post-Cold War era began. 9/11, that's when we were awakened to its full dangers. And 2007, when the financial crisis commenced. The last of these affects our security prospects in 2 ways. First, by weakening already troubled states, diminishing their capacities, while also adding to the store of human desperation and social and economic dislocation worldwide. This is a favorable context for the spread of extremist organizations. Second, the crisis makes the future of our economic power and influence less certain. It weakens our foundation. Considering both the size and projected duration of our current national debt, we now carry a burden greater than at any time in living memory. Bringing it under control may require budget cuts of $300 billion a year, possibly even more. At the same time, interest payments on the debt will grow from 5% to 15% of the budget over the next decade. This pincer movement will constrain our capacity to meet programmed needs as well as to meet emerging ones. The challenge to the essentials of our national strength, our economy, our infrastructure, most of all our people, is real. As we now turn to adjust priorities and get our financial house in order, what we need to keep foremost in our minds are those essentials. They're the foundation on which our national security establishment is built. Looking back over the past 12 or so years, we can now say that our allocation of resources was premised in part on irrational exuberance about available wealth and about available credit. And this left us less attentive to the cost-benefit balance when making investments. In every endeavor, in every area of policy, there is a point of diminishing return. Beyond this, the benefit of investment declines and it becomes less assured. So how far do we push beyond that point of diminishing return? That depends partly on how much wealth and credit we believe is at our disposal. It's that part of the equation that we got seriously wrong over the past 10 or 12 years, and it distorted our choices. A proper appreciation of scarcity would have led us to different choices. Since 1998, U.S. defense spending has risen by about 96% in real terms. This has no precedent in all the years since the Korean War. The post-1998 defense boom is nearly as great as those enacted by Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Reagan combined. And only about half of the recent increase is due to our recent wars and contingency operations. Whether one looks at the total DoD budget or just that portion not attributable to today's wars, U.S. defense spending is now stabilizing at levels significantly above the Cold War peaks. Clearly, what has not occasioned this surge is a neck-and-neck race with a peer competitor. There is none. But what we have seen over the past 10 and 12 years, somewhat more actually, is a substantial expansion in the goals, roles, and missions assigned to our armed forces. Beginning at the end of the Cold War, we pushed our armed forces to prepare for and conduct more types of missions and activities faster and more frequently across a broader expanse of the earth than ever before. And we set out goals that reached well beyond the traditional ones of simple defense and deterrence. We added various forms of preventative action, not only preventative war and regime change, but also greater reliance on our military to shape the strategic environment and transform entire nations. In this light, it's not surprising that we've moved from spending only 2/3 as much as our adversaries during the Cold War to spending more than twice as much today. And that discounts our war spending. Had President Reagan sought an advantage this great, he would have had to triple his budgets. The spending balance reflects the fact that we enjoy abundant overmatch in the conventional realm. And one criteria that we employed in the report in coming up with our recommendations was to trade down some of this overmatch. Another step we took was to roll back some of the soft uses of our military power, so-called environment-shaping functions, where costs are high and payoff is indeterminate. What we focused on were the surge requirements for war in dealing with the conventional realm. A different picture emerges when we survey our recent experience in large-scale counterinsurgency wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. Rather than overmatch, what we see is mismatch. The task force exempted war spending from its cut options. We didn't examine the money that is spent on war. We cordoned that off. And we pegged those spending cuts that we did propose. Well, some would directly affect the wars. Those that would, we pegged to the wars winding down. An example would be reductions in ground forces. Likewise, we cordoned off capabilities directly relevant to counterterrorism, such as special operations forces and intelligence, although the latter, given recent news, may deserve a second look. This doesn't imply that we support the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan or we oppose them. That wasn't our intention. We wanted to look at the long-term budget. However, some of our options do assume that in the long term we are not likely to repeat those experiences again. The fabulous cost, the slow progress, and the uncertain outcome of recent efforts at regime change, armed nation building, and large-scale counterinsurgency make them a poor strategic choice. And there's two parts to that conclusion. One, that it is a choice that we've made, and two, that it's a bad one. Those are some of the concerns, some of the criteria we brought to bear in developing the options. We can discuss others later. I think really the most fundamental point we want to make is that we need to look at this budget with new eyes. And our principal concern cannot be about guns versus butter. Our principal concern has got to be refurbishing and preserving national strength. That's got to be the criteria that we bring to bear in all of our decisions from this point forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Canetta. I was thinking that it was just me referring to you as Dr. Canetta, but now I see that your parents, if they're watching, will be able to see that title in front of you for the entire time. So good for you. Mr. Friedman, if you would.
I also want to thank the chairman and the ranking member and the members of the committee for the opportunity to testify. I'm especially pleased to be here with this distinguished panel, most of whom have been in this business since I was a kid or younger. I want to make two main points today. First, substantially reducing military spending requires reducing the ambitions it serves. Second, a more restrained defense strategy would not only allow cost savings, it would actually improve our security. I am agnostic as to whether our current defense budget is sustainable. I think many foolish things are sustainable, at least for a while. What I do believe is that it would be unwise to spend anything like the $549 billion that the administration requested in the base budget a non-war budget for fiscal year 2011. I think there's no good reason we should now spend more on the non-war defense budget in real terms than we did in any year during the Cold War. So I advocate a more modest defense strategy, one that I call restraint, because it starts with the assumption that power tempts us to take part in foreign troubles that we could and should avoid. Restraint means resisting that temptation. It would husband American power rather than dissipate it in pursuit of ideological and unreachable goals. Restraint does not require cuts in military force structure and spending. It allows them. A less busy military could be a smaller and cheaper one. Now, an alternative approach to saving on defense is to pursue the same ends more efficiently. Efforts to streamline the Pentagon's operations through acquisition reform, eliminating waste and duplication, or improving financial management might save some money, but these reforms have historically delivered few savings, probably because what seems inefficient from a business standpoint, whether it's maintaining essentially 2 air forces, keeping twice as many shipyards open as we need, or building gold-plated weapon systems, is actually efficient in producing political goods, whether it's the services' preferences for weapons or jobs. So rather than efficiency driving savings, I think spending cuts ought to drive efficiency. Market competition encourages private organizations to streamline their operations, and while no such pressure exists in government, by cutting the top line and forcing the services to compete for their budgets, I think we can incentivize them to find some efficiencies themselves. That said, I think it would be a mistake to take up the force structure reductions recommended in my written testimony without their strategic rationale. I think that would badly overburden the force, which would be unfair, without improving security. So as I suggested, the real driver of excessive defense spending is a lack of prioritization, which is the essence of strategy. We spend too much because we choose too little. Unbalanced power and massive budgets have limited the need to choose among priorities. We confuse the necessary with the desirable, our sympathies with the requirements of our safety. The truth is that the United States doesn't really have a defense budget. I think that adjective is wrong. I think our military forces' size and composition now lack a meaningful relationship to the requirements of protecting Americans. For example, our security no longer requires that we defend the European Union, which has a collective economy larger than our own, from Russia or its own dissolution. I think peace among European states is deep-seated. Russia, which now spends less on its aging military than we spend on researching and developing new weapons alone, is not about to reclaim its Soviet empire, let alone threaten Western Europe. South Korea, likewise, long ago grew wealthy enough and then some to defend itself against the North. And neither do we need to defend Japan from China. I think history suggests that the likely result of withdrawing U.S. forces and commitments from Japan will be slightly higher defense spending in Japan and a stable balance of power in China, in large parts because they're separated by a decent-sized body of water. Those states don't have much to fight over today. I also think there's little basis for the claim that you often hear that global trade depends on U.S. military deployments overseas. I think that theory is a little bit too esoteric to discuss briefly here, but I will say that the historical and theoretical case for it is thin. I think it exaggerates the fragility of global markets and trade and the economic impact that supply disruption in a particular region would cause here in the United States. Nor is it wise, I think, to spend heavily on defense today to hedge against the rise of possible future challengers like China. The smaller military that I recommend would maintain a vast superiority over China and all other states for the foreseeable future, particularly at sea and in the air. But the best defense against an uncertain future is a prosperous economy unburdened by excessive spending and debt, which can finance a buildup of military capability if need be. I'll also say that counterterrorism does not require great military spending. The military assets best suited to that are relatively cheap niche capabilities, UAVs, intelligence collectors, and special operations forces. The theory that we can only be safe from jihadists by occupying and ordering the states where they operate has been tested and proved prohibitively costly in blood and treasure. We have been reminded there that we lack the power to organize the politics of unruly foreign states, and evidence suggests, I think, that trying to do so makes us more likely to be a target of terrorism than prevent it. And so state building and occupations, I think, are a business that we should avoid once the current wars end, and that ought to drive down the size required of our ground forces. So to conclude, defining security so broadly is actually counterproductive. Our military posture and activism globally drag us into others' conflicts, provoke animosity, and prompt states to balance our power by arming, driving proliferation. By capitalizing on our geopolitical fortune, we can safely spend far less. By avoiding the occupation of failing states and shedding commitments to defend healthy ones, we could plan for fewer wars. By shedding missions, we can cut force structure, reducing the number of U.S. military personnel and the weapons and vehicles we procure for them, particularly in the ground forces, and reduce operational costs. And my written testimony specifies the cuts I recommend to that end. And with that, I'll conclude and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harrison.
I'd like to thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts on rethinking the defense budget. I've organized my remarks into 5 potential areas of savings, which address many of the options that are presented in the report of the Sustainable Defense Task Force. The first 2 areas, achieving greater efficiencies and refocusing on the core business of defense, are changes that do not affect the size, composition, or capabilities of the military. And the savings in these areas are quite modest. 3 other areas of savings, reforming the military personnel system, reforming the acquisition system, and altering the force structure, have the potential to yield much greater savings, but they involve more substantive changes in the missions and capabilities supported by DoD. The first area is achieving greater efficiencies. Pentagon has again renewed its efforts to reduce waste and achieve greater efficiencies, with Secretary Gates' speech last May directing the services to take an unsparing look at how they operate. Undersecretary Carter has followed up with some specific proposals. Many of these proposals are things that have been tried in the past with various degrees of success. And while working to achieve greater efficiencies should always be a goal of the department, efficiencies alone are not likely to result in the magnitude of savings needed over the coming decade. As Undersecretary Hale noted in a 2002 report on promoting efficiency in DoD, keep trying, but be realistic. The second area of savings is refocusing on the core business of defense. Many programs and activities that are funded within the defense budget stray far from DoD's core mission to deter war and to protect the security of our country. The task force recommends combining the military exchanges and commissaries to achieve savings. I would go one step further and ask, why should DoD be operating a chain of retail stores at all? The exchanges and commissaries are an artifact of a bygone era and could be closed or sold to a private operator. Another activity outside the core business of defense that the task force did not address is the DoD funded and operated primary and secondary school system within the United States. I should note that I'm only talking about the DoD schools within the U.S., not the schools that DoD operates in foreign countries around the world, where military families would likely not have access to an American-style school otherwise. In the U.S., though, education has primarily been the responsibility of the states. DoD notes in its annual report on these schools that the U.S. schools date back to a time of a frontier army post when, quote, adequate public education was not available in the local area. This is no longer the case in the 7 states where these schools are located. And since K-12 education is not core to the business of defense, DoD should transfer these schools either to the states in which they reside or to the Department of Education. The resulting savings in the defense budget could total some $750 million annually. The third area of savings I'd like to address is reforming the military personnel system. DoD is the single largest employer in the United States. It accounts for 51% of federal workers and employs more people than Walmart and the post office combined. Therefore, any changes to military pay and benefits have a profound and lasting effect on the federal budget. Since FY 2000, total military personnel and health care cost per active duty troop has risen 73% in real terms. What is most concerning is that the cost structure within the military compensation system has grown out of balance. For the Department of Defense, 52% of total compensation goes to non-cash and deferred benefits, compared to an average of 29% in the private sector. And just as some private companies have been struggling to remain competitive under the heavy burden of excessive labor costs, so too will the Department of Defense struggle in the years ahead to maintain its force structure if labor costs are not brought back into balance. The task force makes several good proposals in this area, calling for changes to the way pay raises are calculated and raising the enrollment fees military retirees pay for TRICARE. What what the task force doesn't address are problems with the military retirement system. DoD currently uses a cliff vesting retirement system where benefits only become effective after 20 years of service. This system creates distorted incentives because it encourages personnel nearing the 20-year mark to stay on duty even if only for the purpose of attaining the benefit. And after 20 years, when personnel are often in their early 40s, the incentive sharply reverses, encouraging personnel to retire early since they can continue making 50% or more of their military pay while simultaneously drawing full pay at a civilian job. For ways to reform the military retirement system, I would draw your attention to the 10th Quadrennial Review of Military Compensation. One of the most attractive options in this report proposes is to transition from the current defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan, more like a 401k, just as many businesses and state governments have done. The fourth area of savings is reforming the acquisition system. I would divide acquisition reform into two areas, reforming what DoD buys and reforming how DoD buys. 11 of the 19 options in the task force's report fall into the category of reforming what DoD buys. It's true that cutting acquisition programs can yield some of the greatest savings, but such decisions should not be based on budget considerations alone. They should consider which missions and capabilities DoD no longer needs to support and what the effect will be on the industrial base. The task force does not address the issue of reforming how DoD buys things, that is, the acquisition process itself. I would draw your attention to one issue in particular, and that is too many requirements being piled onto weapon systems. Many different organizations within the department have a role in the requirements process, ranging from the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the JROC, to the various organizations within OSD that review and approve programs as they pass through acquisition milestones. Yet few of the organizations that have the power to add, modify, or otherwise influence requirements also have the responsibility to fund programs. Creating a better organizational alignment between those who set requirements and those who budget for programs would reduce the incentive to add the kinds of exquisite requirements that drive up costs and stretch out schedules. The fifth and final area of savings I'd like to address is altering the force structure. The task force recommends several changes to the force structure, including reducing U.S. troops in Asia and Europe by 1/3 and rolling back the size of the Army and the Marine Corps to pre-2007 levels. If the primary intent of these measures is simply to reduce personnel costs, the department would be better served in the long run by first tackling the underlying labor cost structure and only then adjusting the size of the force as necessary. And again, such decisions should not be based on budgetary factors alone. They should be informed by a realistic assessment of future threat environment and a determination of where the department is willing to take risk, a strategic approach. In conclusion, I'd like to note that while a declining defense budget would force the department to make many difficult decisions, it also presents an opportunity. It's an opportunity to transform the military into a more efficient and effective force. Ironically, the rapid rise of the base defense budget over the past decade may have prevented the department from transforming because it allowed the services to continue funding existing programs and not fully commit to transformation. But the era of constrained resources that is now upon us may finally force the services to make the difficult choices that are necessary to create a more efficient and effective military. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Schmidt.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Flake, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I noticed that there's 5 of us up here on the panel, and if this was a hand, I suspect I'm going to be the sore thumb. So will let me.
Could have been otherwise.
Yeah. So I think the hammer is about ready to hit me. So, let me begin with the obvious. We do spend a lot on defense. The task force report is absolutely right when it says that nearly 65% of the increase in federal discretionary spending since 2001 has come from an increase in the Pentagon's budget. But I would say this is a bit misleading. First, we are at war, after all. And even in that, as a percentage of GDP, these wars have been waged more cheaply than similar wars such as Korea or Vietnam. Second, from 2001 to 2010, the baseline defense budget grew by $228 billion. This amounts to an annual real rate of growth of just 4%. Growth, to be sure, but not the gusher Secretary Gates spoke of in May at the Eisenhower Library. And certainly the $228 billion pales in comparison with the nearly $800 billion spent to stimulate supposedly the economy. The report begins with a quote from my good friend Corey Shockey, a former Bush national security official and a McCain campaign advisor. Corey is quoted as saying, quote, "Conservatives need to understand that military power is fundamentally premised on the solvency of the American government and vibrancy of the U.S. economy." I certainly don't disagree. But as she herself states in a recent article, in a recent post, quote, "Advocates of a strong national defense ought to be thinking seriously about entitlement reform, that is Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare." Referencing Congressman Ryan's Roadmap for America, she goes on to say that the real threat to the adequate defense spending is the explosion in domestic programs. Quote, "Defense spending isn't addressed in the roadmap because it's not material to the overall debt picture," end quote. From this perspective, the real problem is not defense spending, but the fact that some 56% of federal outlays are tied to mandatory spending accounts and will, if current budget estimates hold true, expand at an even greater rate. Defense, meanwhile, accounts for 18% of those outlays and will shrink to just 15% in the near years. Now, the task force report, Debts, Deficit, and Defense, is right to think that if $1 trillion could be cut from defense, it would make a difference. I agree. However, let's remember that $300 billion has already been cut from defense the past 2 years, and to follow the report recommendation requires, in my opinion, taking some rather risky steps. However, rather than go through the report's specific list of recommendations, which I'd be happy to talk about in more detail in the question and answer session, let me make the broad point that the force structure they outline is one that runs against the basic force structure that has been agreed upon by 3 successive administrations, 2 Democrat and 1 Republican. It seems to me that we ought to think twice before jettisoning a force structure that by any standard has performed remarkably well, has done so at a very high tempo, and has enjoyed bipartisan post-Cold War support for more than a decade and a half. Now, having said that, there's no question that savings can be had when it comes to defense. Todd here, I think, has laid out a number of useful proposals. Health and personnel costs have skyrocketed over the past decade, and while benefits for those in the all-volunteer force must remain high, there's no question that there are elements of the Pentagon's budget that need closer scrutiny. However, the real problem, and I realize just how difficult an argument it is to make these days, is that we spend too little on defense. The key point here is that the procurement holiday that marked much of the 1990s was a hole the Bush administration never dug the Pentagon out of. And now the Obama administration wants to hold defense spending flat or less in the coming years, which, when combined with the rising personnel costs and rising operations and maintenance costs, has resulted in a significant shortage in resources, perhaps, according to the Congressional Budget Office, on the order of $30 to $40 billion a year, needed to recapitalize our armed forces. All of which brings me to my final point. The danger today is that the chronic underfunding of our core defense capabilities, we will slip into a posture of strategic retrenchment through inadvertence. In this respect, one of the virtues of the report is that it does not hide the strategic implications of its cuts, raising at the end a very different vision for American grand strategy from what it has been. By my lights, it's a path I prefer we not take. I don't think we should let go of a strategy that has, among other things, successfully prevented destructive wars between the great powers and helped shape an international order which, for all its problems, remains relatively stable. No doubt, it has cost the American taxpayer a lot to maintain, but the benefits we have gotten in return in terms of general peace, the expansion of democratic rule around the globe, and our own prosperity, I believe, are benefits that are far greater. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Adams.
Thank you very much, Chairman Tierney. Congressman Flake, appreciate the opportunity to testify here. One of the advantages, of course, of coming last is that everybody's already said the things I was going to say, but of course not everybody has said them, so I will try to be brief. I want to make 3 very simple points and introduce my testimony for the record, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman. Simple point number 1 is the Defense Department is now facing a planning crisis that it is not yet fully anticipated, and it's not yet ready to cope with what is going to hit it. All budgets, in fact, all planning in the federal government is resource constrained. So we cannot sit here and say we totally want the force that we want to have and we want it to do what we want it to do independent of resources. It's always been resource constrained, and this week, of course, the Congress is beginning the process of marking up appropriations for fiscal 2011, which is going to constrain, among other things, defense from the administration's request. But even that constraint doesn't begin to cope with the tidal waves that are hitting the Department of Defense over the next 2 or 3 years and over the next decade, which all of you in Congress are going to have to deal with. The tidal waves take two forms. Tidal wave number one, which has been amply discussed here, is the tidal wave of deficits and debt at historically high shares of gross domestic product, and frankly with forecasts for that debt and those deficits that are still quite optimistic compared to what we may encounter as Congress works through the fiscal agenda over the next few years. Second tidal wave hitting defense is that we are, in fact, at some point, not too distant future, pulling back from Iraq, pulling back from Afghanistan, which means that the public willingness to tolerate extremely high and unprecedentedly high levels of defense spending is going to weaken and go away. That is the natural course of things. Now, we have been to this movie before. We were at this movie from 1985 to 1998. From 1985, when deficit reduction began, through 1998, overall national defense outlays fell 20% in constant dollars. DoD budgets fell 36% in constant dollars over that period of time. What caused that change? Step one, a major attention of the Congress and the White House to deficits and debt reduction. Step number two, the end of the Cold War, where the major strategic planning scenario that undergirded our defense budget disappeared. Combining those two things, starting with the first Bush administration, those budgets went down, the force structure shrank by a third, 50% cut in constant dollars in procurement budgets, and lots of program kills, most of them begun under the Bush administration. But that is what happens as the cycle of defense changes and as the politics of the globe change. So we are heading for another one of those periods in our history, and you in Congress are going to have to cope with it. The department is not yet there. Second point I want to make is the tried and true way of achieving savings, some of which have been mentioned in testimony so far, are inadequate to cope with this decline. In fact, we've created pressures for upward growth in defense budgets over the last decade. End strength has grown, not shrunk. End strength determines a lot of where the budget is going. Personnel costs have been growing faster than personnel costs in the economy as a whole. The retirement costs for the Department of Defense personnel have grown. Health care is grown at a faster rate than Medicare costs have grown. Overhead has grown, meaning the tail is now larger than the tooth, is now becoming larger than the tooth. Operations and maintenance costs grow inexorably at 2.5% per year, and that seems not change regardless of party administration or era. And acquisition reform, much touted acquisition reform currently is really, frankly, a recycling of ideas we've dealt with before. Acquisition reform keeps proving to be a mirage. And it's a mirage, frankly, because in the acquisition system, the incentives are wrong. It's not just a question of requirements. If services have to buy in to get systems at an affordable budget, they'll buy in at a cheaper cost than they project the system to cost. If contractors have to buy in order to win a contract, they will buy in at a cheaper cost than the system turns out to cost. So the incentive structure makes acquisition reform an uphill battle. Third point I want to make. I think that Secretary Gates, who is trying to protect 1% real growth in defense budgets, is actually fighting a losing battle. And the key to now constraining defense is going to be in mission discipline. Sadly, the Quadrennial Defense Review did not execute mission discipline. It simply layered missions on top of each other without setting priorities and without calculating the risks of the various missions and the risks that we as a nation are prepared to tolerate. I can associate myself with many of the comments that have been made about mission, but I think we are at a point in American history where a serious baseline discussion of strategy and mission is an essential part of how we approach defense planning and defense forces. The bottom line here has to do with looking seriously at counterterror missions and whether they should have been fenced, looking at the counterinsurgency, stabilization, and nation-building missions so we don't draw the wrong lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, looking carefully at how many nations in the world we want to build partner capacity in, ensuring that we maintain deterrence, alliance support, and conventional war in what is one of the safest periods in our national security history, And finally, in looking seriously at rebalancing the toolkit, so we in fact do more strategic planning with civilian agencies, we make governance, stabilization, and reconstruction civilian, not military missions, and reinforce our diplomacy. Last point, I would urge the Congress to give serious consideration to unifying the budget functions for defense and foreign policy so we can make those kinds of trade-offs. So in sum, defense budgets are resource constrained. The current tools for dealing with those resource constraints are inadequate. And indeed, as was said earlier on this panel, I think it was Dr. Friedman who said it, spending cuts will drive efficiencies. We've seen that before. I predict we will see it again. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Adams, and thank all of you for your testimony, written and verbal here today. We're going to go to our question period here, 5 minutes per member, and I'm going to start, but I think it's a great jumping off point from Dr. Adams' comments, which were reflected in some of the other testimony here. Is I don't know that we really have a budget in the Department of Defense. It seems to me that we just spend whatever we think we want to spend, and I think the last comment about piling on mission on top of mission just seems to be going, and if we have a weakness in our civilian capacities, then we ask the military to take that on. It's not to say that they're not good at it, they're not willing to do it, or they're not well-intentioned, but it sometimes seems out of line for what they really are proposed to do and designed to do on that. So let me ask this generally, if we were to concentrate just on making the military that we have more efficient, getting rid of some waste, fraud, and abuse, are we all pretty much in agreement that would be a far less significant savings than if we really took a look at the mission and took a look at just how we structure it? What are the purposes of the mission of the Department of Defense? Do you have any disagreement on that, Dr. Schmidt? Do you disagree with that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think the best you can expect out of efficiency of any government organization is probably 5%, and boy, is that even hard to do. So, yeah, you're
That's
really
a big
talking about
number. I
missions.
mean, if we could get 5%, I guess in this world,
Well,
we're all
that's
pretty
the
happy on
that's the
on
golden
that
apple.
basis.
So I wouldn't count on it either.
We're trying. We have a lot of hearings in that design on that, but the other part is I would suspect that we have to worry about efficiencies and a budget within the Department of Defense, but as policymakers, we ought to also look at what the Department of Defense budget is within our overall budget on that basis, and take a look at it. I think a number of you have testified that you think that there's a situation here where what is spent in the military is material to the overall debt picture, except Dr. Schmidt, you quoted somebody in your testimony saying that they didn't think that the defense spending was material at all to the overall debt picture. Is that a position you endorse?
No, not technically. I mean, look, it obviously would help to cut defense spending, but I also think that the costs for the kinds of cuts that have been proposed by the task force really raise larger questions about the ultimate cost of the country. So, on the whole, I would say the real problem fiscally, yes, defense cuts would help fiscally, but not substantially, and that the real issue is the entitlement programs.
Mr. Chairman, could I comment
Yeah, I'd
briefly on
like
just
somebody to
some-
comment on that.
some
Dr.
data?
Adams.
The defense has obviously played a role. The largest single source of spending growth over the past decade in the federal government has obviously been on the mandatory side. On the discretionary side, the defense budget has gone up, has absorbed something like 2/3 of the overall increase in discretionary spending. And that's been driven in large part by war costs, the costs of Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's no question that it has contributed to our deficit. And interestingly, national defense has over 19% share of all fiscal 2010 federal spending, which is the same as Social Security, and it's 3% higher than of all means-tested entitlement programs combined. Now, that excludes Social Security, because that's not means-tested. But if you look at mean-tested programs, defense is obviously, there's a kind of a third piece here in terms of overall spending. So clearly, from the spending side of the equation, what Congress faces, and what I think anybody seriously addressing deficit reduction and debt control faces, is how do you put all the pieces on the table at the same time? Since 1985 to 98, the period I mentioned earlier, what clearly made deficit reduction possible, because people disagree on where the cuts ought to come, was when that deficit exercise, starting with Graham Redmond Hollings in 1985, put all pieces of first discretionary spending on the table, and then with the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, put discretionary, mandatory, and revenues on the table with both caps and pay-go. Those two things in the 1990s, combined with a healthy economy, which we don't have right now, were enough to drive us into surplus by the end of the decade. If we even made some progress of that kind, it would be a good thing for the economy. The problem that we have is you can't get agreement, I believe, here in the Congress unless all those pieces are on the table, and that's going to inevitably involve the administration as well. So if you want to do it, you've got to do it with everything on the table.
And I think indicative of this day, I don't think there's a lot of competing hearings out there necessarily, but I'm struck by the lack of attention to this particular subject, as if people don't want to deal with it or don't want to go there on that. Mr. Knetter, do you see some value in our national security and whether or not our seniors are secure in their retirement, whether or not people have health care, whether or not they have an opportunity for education, and whether or not that we in fact have job training and research and development, things like that? How does that play into our national security structure?
There's been a lot of interesting work done, analysis of our operations in war, of our success in war. Stephen Biddle, an analyst with the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's also been in the service school system, has produced a number of reports looking at why we won so well. For instance, in the first Persian Gulf War, often the assumption is that we win because of our technology. And what he demonstrates, I think pretty convincingly, that it's not that. We win because of a combination of our technology, our training, our people, our capacity to work as a team. We need to ask ourselves, the point I'm getting at here is that I think people are the most important part of our armed forces. We have a volunteer military, and we are able to fill it with quality people. And why is that possible for us and not as possible for others, other nations? And I think part of the answer is that we as a nation pay attention to the health, the education, and the welfare of our people. So certainly that is a contributor, a factor in our ability to put together the military we do. And I think that's the type of thinking we need to approach this we need to approach it from that perspective. We need a holistic approach and to understand that many of the benefits are indirect, but they're real.
Thank you very much. Mr. Flake.
Thank you. Thank you all. That was very, very enlightening. Mr. Harrison, you mentioned that one of the problems we have with cost is requirements keep getting piled on to weapon systems. Can you explain a little further on that? How does that raise costs, and what can we do to remedy that?
Well, what happens on acquisition programs is, as one of the services, gets together and says, okay, we need some new weapon system to fill a capability gap, and then it goes up for review. The other services get their chance, their hack at it. The combatant commanders get to look at it, and the more people that look at it, the more people that touch it, they tend to start adding more and more requirements to it. And even once the system begins development, people will look at it again and say, oh, well, now that I understand it better, I would like it to do X or Y or Z, and you end up with a program that just keeps growing and growing and growing. Every requirement you add adds cost. And even once you've added a requirement, if you try to take that requirement out, it may also add cost. So, the discipline in the acquisition system is important, that people have to be willing to say, okay, here's the weapon system we're going to build, here are the capabilities that it really needs to have, and we're going to take our hands off of it and let industry build it under the contract that we've given them, and then we'll take delivery of it. But too often, we have these program offices that stay in the loop, and all these other different bodies that review requirements at every acquisition milestone, and it just keeps opening up the door every time for people to add more to it, and the costs just start to grow.
Thank you. Mr. Friedman, you seem not very confident that we can decrease defense spending by realigning the mission or reevaluating our objectives, but rather we should impose spending cuts and then let that define the mission. Is that accurate? Or
I'm confident that having less ambitious missions would cut spending. I'm not confident that efficiency gains would reap a lot of savings. My view is that there are a lot of efficiency gains to be had. The problem is that there's no free lunch politically. I mean, the requirements process these weapons get a lot of requirements because the services have various constituencies that want things from them. I mean, a destroyer does a lot of things, and there's a lot of people in the Navy who want something from a destroyer. So it's hard to deal with that. Similarly, the commissaries. I mean, everybody knows that you could save a lot of money on the commissaries, but the people going to the commissaries really like the discounts that they're getting at the commissaries. It's basically a benefit. So I don't disagree that you can't save money on that. I disagree that you can save money on that without political pain. You know, shipyards are another big one. I mean, we got too many shipyards. You close some shipyards, you can cut overhead costs on procurement of ships, but nobody wants to close a shipyard because those are big employers. So my point is just that it's very hard to do.
I'm
May
from
I-
Arizona. We can close a lot of shipyards. No problem at all.
May I-
Mr. Canetta,
The reform impulse during the 1990s was fairly strong, at least on the political end, but it isn't how we achieved savings during that period. The principal savings were achieved first by reductions in structure because of the end of the Cold War, and then because we were able to cascade so much of the equipment that had been modernized during the Reagan era into the Clinton era. So we in a sense, got a free ride. The idea of the impetus for increased efficiencies during that period was to answer the question, how do we now increase modernization spending again without losing the peace dividend? How are we going to be able to do that? And so the answer was we're going to find all these efficiencies in a wide variety of ways. Many of them never really went forward. They were going against a resistant medium. Some of them did, but they were, and the most successful was the BRAC process, which incidentally took a lot of the decision-making power out of the Pentagon and out of the political process, and that helped a great deal. But even there, the net savings probably didn't amount in the end to more than 3 or 4% of the total budget. Part of the problem here, as others have pointed out, is that there is a resistant medium. And what one really needs, I think, is to be able to approach the topic from the perspective that these cuts must occur, that the cuts are our premise. And from that point forward, you've got to find out how to apply them. That wasn't the case then. And eventually what happened is we had to rebound the budget in order to feed modernization. But it needs to be our premise in the future.
okay, thank you. One more question, Mr. Schmidt. You mentioned that there are areas of savings that we can find. I think you said in personnel and whatnot. From the report that's been issued, what other areas other than personnel cost, overhead, retirement, in terms of acquisition or whatever, where do you see savings that can be had?
Well, I think it's a real difficulty when they're talking about, in the report, talking about cutting force structure, because I think force structure is the bone that's left after the administration has really cut $300 billion already from future programs. So we're getting close to, we have to make a decision. Do we really want to cut force structure? Then I go back to my original point, which is that this is a force structure, more or less, that several administrations, Democratic and Republican, have agreed on. So I think there's efficiencies. Look, TRICARE has to be adjusted. The health care benefits are driving up O&M. So those are real issues. There's other things that can be done. I would look at, for example, there are overseas bases that probably can be reduced in numbers, but I don't think it gets you anywhere close to the kinds of savings that maybe we in Congress would like, or Congress would like to have fixed the fiscal problem that we face. I just want to sort of go back to one thing that Gordon said, which is he noted that 19% of federal outlays go to defense now. Well, 19% is basically what it was when he was at OMB. Federal outlays for defense, have not grown inordinately. And the truth is the Obama administration will take the defense outlays for defense down to around 15% in a few years. So if I had to step back from this, I would say that the problem isn't defense, it's these other issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Welch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and the ranking member, Mr. Frank and Mr. Paul, for their leadership on this. There's two issues as I hear your testimony. One is just trying to cull the budget and look at where you can get efficiencies, and that's been something that various Congresses have attempted to do. You've identified some places for savings, like perhaps the benefits I think Dr. Adams, you indicated that a lot of the procurement reforms are a rehash. But then the second area, which is probably more promising for savings, is examining the force structure and the mission. That's a debate Congress has not yet had. And it seems as though there has been an acceptance in Congress, whether explicit or implicit, that one of the responsibilities of our military is now, in fact, to take on the challenge of nation building. In order also to accomplish that goal, we outsource a very substantial component of the effort. We've got 100,000 troops or so in Afghanistan, 100,000 contractors. So I would like to just hear briefly from each of you as to what precise elements of a policy could you recommend we focus on that would achieve savings. There was discussion about nation building. There was discussion about the question of force structure. And I'll start with you, Mr. Harrison.
If you're looking for, larger savings, I think that you're correct that, the place to achieve large savings is in changing the type of weapon systems we buy and altering our force structure, reducing the force structure in certain areas. Not to stray too far outside of my expertise as a budget guy, but if you look at, our threat environment around the world, I think it's true that threats have diminished somewhat in Europe. So maybe we could draw back some of our forces from there. With Asia, I'm not so sure. I see good arguments on either side of that, that threats might be rising or that they might be balanced by some of our allies that are in that region. But I think if you're going to make these cuts, you don't want to cut force structure or weapon systems just for the purpose of achieving savings. I think
Schmidt? We'll just move on.
Okay.
You have any comments on that? I've only got 5 minutes, so I'd like to get your
I
comments.
understand. I think you've raised the right issue, which is that when we're talking about the kinds of decisions that have to be made, if we really want to sort of cut deficits and use the defense budget to really participate in reducing the deficits, you're going to be talking about cutting force structure in substantial ways, which is bound to have, and I think one of the things about the report that's most honest is that calls for different kinds of grand strategy. I personally wouldn't go that route. I think it's more dangerous over the long term, but that's absolutely the question that should be on the table. And I think, frankly, it's the question that we haven't debated over the last several years. So this hearing, in fact, is really useful in that regard because it raises the key issue.
Dr. Adams?
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for asking that question, because I do think it's the essential question here. There is no particular magic in a force structure number. Dr. Schmidt's been referring to the fact that all these administrations have agreed on a force structure number. Well, the reality is circumstances change, and force structure requirements change as those circumstances change. So when the Cold War ended, we took a force that was 2.2 million down to 1.4 million, over a period of 4 or 5 years because circumstances had changed. So the real question we have to ask ourselves is, have circumstances changed? What is the lesson, if there is a lesson, of Iraq and Afghanistan? What is the lesson of terrorism? What is the mission of the military forces that emerge from those lessons and the circumstances in the world? Let me make just 3 points. One is, overall, the United States faces right now, today, no existential threat, completely different circumstance from the Cold War, right? We are, in fact, living in a safer world. Point number 2, the volume, rate, and lethality of conflict around the world has gone down over the past 20 years, not up. As a consequence, the challenges that we face that might even involve our forces are less than what they once were. Number 3, if the lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan is that the United States military has an expanded function for fighting terrorists, countering terrorist organizations, arming other countries, training their security forces, fighting insurgencies, not sure where they are, but fighting insurgencies on a global basis, and nation building, that's the set of missions that need to have a very, very hard scrub by the Congress of the United States. There is a cottage industry at DOD today, a cottage industry supported right now by this administration that would have that mission set for the department expand rather than contract. That, I think, is the critical circumstance that Congress needs to look at today in threat terms, in capability terms, in mission terms, in seeking a much more standardized and shrunk American military force.
Okay, thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Welch. Mr. Luchtmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was kind of struck with some of the discussion we just had here. You know, I think sometimes we can be penny wise and security foolish if we forget about the purpose of the military, which is our number one duty as congressmen, is to protect and defend our country and the Constitution. So I'm curious, some of the cuts and things that you suggested, Mr. Friedman, how is that going to impact our ability to stage operations around the world if we close down some bases in certain areas?
Well, logistically, certainly it's helpful if you want to have a war in Europe to have bases in Europe. Similar, the same goes for Asia. So we're not saying that there's no.
Yeah, but with all due respect, I know that we have a big Army base or hospital base in Germany right now that tends to a lot of our men and women who come from Iraq and Afghanistan who are injured. Are you saying we need to move that or do something different?
I wouldn't recommend closing that while we're still sending wounded people from Iraq or Afghanistan there. In the future, I would be, after those wars are over, I think I would recommend doing that along with bringing all our bases from Europe back, because I don't think there's much in Europe that requires U.S. military forces. My argument, going back to the last question, is not necessarily that there were no threats left in these regions or never will be. My argument is that there are other nations, wealthy ones, in those regions that are perfectly capable of defending themselves when those threats arise. And sure, you know, there's some risk associated with not having troops in the places where I'd like to not have troops, but there's also a risk with having them there in terms of the cost that comes through the force structure of having those missions, and there's a risk associated with participating in a war that we maybe could avoid. So I think there's dangers on both sides.
How do you think that makes us vulnerable?
Which part of it?
What are the vulnerabilities if you cut back on things like that?
I'm sorry.
How do you make us more vulnerable?
How do I make us
Don't you think you make us more vulnerable by doing some of those things?
I think having forces in places where we don't necessarily need to be, because we don't need to participate in a war there, because a host country has the capability to do it themselves, make us more vulnerable, because I'd like to avoid fighting in wars that we could avoid. Wars are dangerous and bad things. They're very costly. So that's the sense in which I mean that. And I think they make us more vulnerable because we have to maintain force structure associated with those missions, which is very costly.
I know that there, you know, I'm speaking more than just the bases themselves. I'm talking about all of the military operations, all the equipment that they have. I'm very familiar with a young man, for instance, who flies an F-16 that is 22 years old, broke down twice while he was in Afghanistan and again on the way home. I certainly would not want to curtail his ability to have a piece of equipment that he can be safe in and protect our men and women who are on the ground with. I think that again, we can be penny wise and security foolish if we're not careful in how we do the structure of the cuts you're talking about. I'm also curious, and I saw in listening to Secretary Clinton last night, she had an interview and made the comment that there was no intention of pulling out and continue to support Afghanistan and Pakistani efforts. How do you see this playing out, Dr. Schmidt? Dr. Schmidt.
I expect if we're to be successful in Afghanistan that the reductions that are being talked about in 2011 will be very minimal, and the likelihood of actually having a substantial number of forces in Afghanistan for an extended period are quite high. The difficulty with counterinsurgencies is you simply need boots on the ground. They succeed if you have enough boots on the ground. Historically, they succeed. If you don't have enough boots on the ground, you won't succeed. But they do take time, and they do take resources, and the question is, do you want to put those resources in? And if you don't, then what are the consequences for abandoning Afghanistan once again?
Very quickly, how many of you have served in the military? One. How many of you have members of the family in the military right now?
Right now,
None. Okay. Dr. Schmidt, just very quickly, what do you think by these? Do you think the the lack of, the concern that we may have here or need to take into consideration is the effect that it may have on our own economy if there's instability in the world, by not controlling activities around the world that could impugn or impact us in a certain way?
Yeah, I mean, one of the points I tried to make, and I hopefully made in the statement itself, is that we've had a very expensive global posture since the end of World War II. We've had one since the end of the Cold War. I think that's led to general stability and prosperity around the world. It's very costly from the U.S. perspective, but on the whole, it's allowed us to grow economically and allowed our allies to grow economically. And I think, in fact, in terms of the sort of world order, the benefits outweigh the costs that we put into it. There's no question that it's costly, but I think, again, the benefits are much more there than not. The second thing I would say is that we get used to that order. We're used to the trade traveling around the world without any disruption. We're used to oil flowing from the Persian Gulf. But remember the first Persian Gulf War. Just think what the consequences of that if we did not have the sufficient troops to push Saddam out of Kuwait. So these are things that we tend to assume are going to go on in the absence of the security role that the United States plays. I personally think that that's a bad bet.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the witnesses for helping the committee with its work. Normally, in the midst of two wars, we wouldn't be, this is not I guess the typical time when we would grapple with reducing defense spending, but I think the deficits and the financial situation requires us to do so. We do have an opportunity now in August, our troop deployment in Iraq will go from 165,000 down to 50,000. So maybe it is an opportunity to rebalance and reassess some of this. After September 11th, we saw a big shift from military responsibilities and intelligence responsibilities going over to the contractor side. As the chairman has said, a lot of us on this committee have been over to Iraq. I've been over there at least 12 times, Afghanistan and Pakistan probably another 10 times. And it's amazing the amount of responsibilities that used to be core military or intelligence or State Department functions that we've contracted out. And now, last couple of weeks, we heard a report from Secretary Gates who said that when we hire a private contractor to take over a responsibility that was formerly performed by a government personnel, that we pay 25% more to have that contractor do it. And I think there's a real opportunity for savings here, and I want to know from your standpoint, is this an area where we're looking at where we're paying that premium to have private contractors handle this? And I've heard it from everybody. I've heard it from Treasury, I've heard it from USAID, I've heard it from the military that, these contractors are cleaning up and they're making pretty hefty profits, and that's all at the cost of the American taxpayer. And we've got to be smarter now and more resourceful and more prudent with the way we're spending money. Is this an area that we should be looking at to reduce those costs performed by contractors and have them instead performed more efficiently and more cheaply by government personnel?
Mr. Chair, because Congressman, could I tackle at least one cut at that?
Sure, that'd be great,
I know others
Mr.
on the
Doctor.
panel may want to as well. I think this fall, contractor versus civil service versus uniform is one of those areas where you might get certain kinds of efficiencies, but you also pay certain kinds of costs. In other words, the key issue for me really here remains mission. What is it we're doing, and then who is it responsible for doing it? When I was at OMB, we did an awful lot of time working on what they call circular A76 comparisons. They said, would it be cheaper to contract it out? Would it be cheaper to do it in-house? And these are notoriously difficult calculations to make. The short-term advantage of doing it with contractors is once the contract is done, the contractor can go away and you don't assume responsibility for the contractor. So up front, it may cost you more, dollar for dollar in the given year, to do a certain function with a contractor. Long term, you're not going to be invested in that contractor for life.
And that's a great point, Dr. Gordon, but Dr. Adams, but we're talking about core functions.
Absolutely.
They're not going, these functions
Absolutely.
are not going away,
No.
so this is perpetual contracting.
No, and
I'm talking about those functions, not something that's gonna, the need for it's
Absolutely, and
gonna go
I'm
away.
I'm going straight there with you.
Okay.
The cost, this is just an analysis I'm giving you right now. On the do it on the government side, you can do it probably more efficiently, although the cost comparisons tend to be difficult because of where you allocate wages and salaries. When you do it on the government side, of course, you're investing in somebody over a lifetime, which means it's not just the direct costs up front, it's the lifetime costs, the benefits, the retirement pay, and so on. So it makes these comparisons very difficult to do. The problem that I think we've gotten into is more substantive than the issue of cost, and it's the question you raise. That is, we are now asking contractors to do things which ought to be done under the inherently government function title by public sector employees. If we do the sets of roles and missions that we're doing currently, it's going to be enormously expensive to acquire the government personnel to do all of those, which is why the question of mission is tied to the question of whether you do it by a contractor or in the public sector. In other words, to have the right-sized force, you've got two things you've got to deal with. One is, how much are you asking people to do? And the second thing, which we haven't talked about, is what's the relationship between your tooth and your tail? Historically, we have now something on the order of 2/3 of the active duty military personnel actually involved in tail, not in tooth. And the ratio of combat forces to tail has actually gotten worse over the past 50 years. It was closer to 50-50 50 years ago. It's now about 2/3, 1/3 tail to tooth. So the other piece of managing this in the government sector is not necessarily adding people, it is redefining what people's jobs are and how much of a tail you actually need as opposed to the tooth that you need up front.
Thank you, Donald.
Thank you, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. It's been a very interesting and informative panel. I don't have any questions. I just want to make a few comments. When you add up the regular military budget, the supplemental and emergency appropriations, the military construction budget, the money that comes in at the end of the year in omnibus bills, we're spending more on defense than all the other countries in the world combined. And as Dr. Canetta has pointed out, a 96% increase just since 1998, about 3 times the rate of inflation over that period. And most people in the country, if you ask them, they would tell you they're against massive foreign aid, but what they don't realize is that we have turned the Department of Defense in the last many years into the Department of Foreign Aid, because most, or at least very much, of what the Defense Department does now is just pure nation building, which is another word for foreign aid, and we simply can't afford it. And I agree with Mr. Friedman that much of our interventionist foreign policy that we followed over the last several years has created great resentment around the world, and has made terrorism more likely instead of less likely. And when you sit and think about it, and about what we've gotten for over $1 trillion now in Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting against militaries or organizations like Al-Qaeda. The main anti-terrorism official in the UN said a few months ago that Al-Qaeda was now so small it was having trouble maintaining credibility, but we're fighting against organizations or militaries with budgets of less than 0.1% of ours. And these threats have been so greatly exaggerated. I voted for the first Gulf War because I went to all those briefings and heard all the generals and the people from the Defense Department, the State Department, tell how great the threat was and talk about Saddam Hussein's elite troops. And then I saw those same elite troops surrendering to CNN camera crews and empty tanks. And I realized then that the threat had been greatly exaggerated, and it still has been over these last many years. And so what have we gotten for all this money? Last weekend we had another suicide bomber in Iraq, 48 people killed. The situation there is still just terrible. And then I saw in the current issue of Newsweek, Richard Haas, chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he is in favor, there's never been intervention that he hasn't favored, I suppose. But he wrote about Afghanistan, we're not winning, it's not worth it. And he says in this article, the economic costs to the United States of sticking to the current policy are on the order of $100 billion a year in economic costs. The military price is also great, not just in lives and material, but also in distraction from other potential problems. I was impressed with Mr. Harrison talking about the personnel costs, because we've sent so many factories to foreign countries, other countries over the last 30 years, that now for many young people in small towns and rural areas, their only way out, or their greatest, the highest pay they can receive, is in the military. But we can't afford to keep increasing the military pay and benefits like we have been, especially when we're headed into a time when the entire federal budget is going to be taken up by Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and various pensions. So I appreciate what most of these gentlemen are doing. Most of the think tanks and others that favor increasing the military budget at this point are supported by the defense contractors. And the defense contractors hire all the retired admirals and generals. And really what all this is about money and power instead of any real threat to us. And I'm just amazed that more conservative Republicans aren't awake. I think some are awakening to this, because fiscal conservatives should be the ones most horrified by what is going on here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. I appreciate it. Ms. Chu.
Mr. Adams, you argue that U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan have led to the abuse of the emergency supplemental process and actually funded defense spending that is wholly unrelated to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Can you explain how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have bloated the non-war defense budget?
Sorry, could you say that again, Congresswoman?
Can you? Well, you have argued that the.
Yeah, I heard. Yeah.
So can you explain how it's bloated the non-war defense budget?
Yeah. There are two principal ways in which the supplementals and the war titles have been used over time in a way that funds expenditures in the Department of Defense that are not directly war-related. One, which is pretty visible, is putting into the supplemental budgets hardware, military equipment, and procurement that is unrelated to equipment losses in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that has clearly been done. It was true of the supplementals more than it has been true of the recent war titles in the budgets. But every single war supplemental has carried over the first, starting with the first one, has carried spending for equipment that basically restocks inventories here at home or in exercises for the military, but is not replacing equipment lost in Afghanistan or Iraq. So one of the agreements that the new administration, the Obama administration, when it came in, negotiated with the Department of Defense was to restrict the uses of the supplementals for purchasing equipment that ought to be in the regular base equipment acquisition planning of the services. There remains a gray area there, and the gray area is what's called reconstitution. So I always urge the Congress to take a very close look at what's called reset or reconstitution in war titles and supplementals for equipment that really ought to be funded through the base budget because it's in the long-term plan for the services. The other area that's more difficult to tease out is in operations and maintenance, and about 2/3 of the spending for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan falls in operations and maintenance. Okay, this is the support for troops that are in the field. It's not their pay, but it's the support services for the troops. Some of it is going to the contractors we were talking about earlier. The unique characteristic of operations and maintenance funding in budgetary terms is its fungibility. That is to say, money appropriated for operations and maintenance to the departments and to the military services is essentially fungible with any other money appropriated to operations and maintenance, which means from the services point of view, operations and maintenance funding, which is 2/3 of the war sup, is funding that is also useful for their general operations and maintenance and can easily be moved around inside the service budget to fund operations and maintenance requirements at home. That area has not been sufficiently scrutinized by the Congress. It does constitute a significant addition of O&M resources to the services.
You've also said that that what we should learn from Iraq and Afghanistan is that we do not need a military capable of intervening globally in all conflicts and disorder, and that we could prioritize missions that could maintain or even enhance our national security at less costs with smaller forces. Can you explain what kind of military missions you have in mind, how it could work considering the threat of al-Qaeda?
Sure, and I know others on the panel may have responses they want to give to that because they've talked about the area of mission. This is, I think, the fundamental issue. What is the role and responsibility of the United States globally? What are the challenges that we face? What is the role and mission of the military in meeting those challenges? We don't often talk about it that way, but defense forces are basically a support function for our national security policy. They are not our national security policy. They're a support function for it. So the real question that I think we haven't addressed yet but now need to urgently is, in the array of missions that we have, which ones are most important to the security of the United States? How much is the military role in carrying out those missions? And how much force do we need to actually execute those missions? The most highly debatable area of mission right now today is in this area of counterinsurgency, stabilization, nation building, counterterrorism, and building partner capacity. That whole envelope of missions is an area where defense responsibilities have expanded enormously, and where the lesson we seem to have drawn from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan is we now need to be prepared to do those missions on a global basis. There's no sustained analysis of that proposition. We have excellent work on how to do counterinsurgency. 80% of it, by the way, is considered a civilian function in the counterinsurgency manual. We have no analytical text that tells us where, when, how, and why the United States is responsible for those missions on a global basis and where we're going to have to execute them. So right now we have no analysis of that area of mission in terms of policy and challenge that should tell us how many forces we have. And I think that's highly questionable, that our national security is engaged every time there is a terrorist attack, every country where there is an insurgent, every country that has a fragile state, every country that has a security sector. Right now we have an open door on mission and an open door on budgets without any analysis. If we turn that around and take a hard, cold look at that area, I think we will discover that we don't have as many areas where we need to conduct those kinds of missions. We are not peculiarly well suited in the military to carry them out, governance, reconstitution, and so on. And we don't have so many countries where we need to worry about doing them. Where that leads me is to say we can take a step back in that area of mission, and we can look seriously at our civilian capacities in the government to execute those parts of those missions that involve governance and economic development, which is the long-term responsibility that we and many other countries and international organizations have, but involve substantially less commitment of military force, certainly not on a global basis. We then return to missions that others have talked about here, which have more to do with the traditional functions of the military: deterrence, allied reassurance, conventional warfare, and a niche set of missions that may involve the military part of counterterrorism, humanitarian operations, non-emergency evacuation operations, and the like, where we can tailor a force that I would suggest is considerably smaller than the force that we have today. It would be more efficient and more scope to do those kinds of missions. So in a very brief description, that's how I would approach the question of missions.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Thank you, Ms. Chu. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't get to hear everyone's testimony. I assume Dr. Schmidt is not here, and frankly, I wouldn't be either. But how many of the rest of the panel are supportive of a freeze to defense spending, or a cut to defense, or freeze over an extended period of time, which in essence be a cut? Who on the panel supports that step? And I'll go down the line. Freeze or a reduction, and Dr., you support that?
For me, it depends. It depends on what changes we're making in the missions that we're willing for our military to support, and what risks we're willing to take.
Okay. I didn't want to speak for you, Dr. Schmidt, but I assume that's where. Just a blanket cap or freeze.
No, I wouldn't support that.
All right, Dr. Adams?
Definitely support
Yes or no?
Sorry, definitely support it.
Definitely support it. Now, the 4.5, or 3.5, I guess, who supported the cap, would you support the same type of approach to every other agency in the government? Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy, Defense, or not Defense, but Education, up and down the line? Yeah.
It depends. I mean, we got to talk agency by agency. I can't speak for every agency, so
Okay,
we have to go one at a time.
I think that given our current circumstance, we should start with the premise of proportionate cuts. We should determine what types of deficit reduction we need, begin with proportionate cuts as a premise, and go from there. I don't think we end up with proportionate cuts. That becomes a question of matching need to budget.
I think the spending freeze on non-security related discretionary spending that's in the president's budget this year, I think that's a good thing.
Okay. Mr. Schmidt, would you agree with?
Freeze and or cuts.
Yeah.
Definitely support it. I worked for 5 years in the Clinton administration in OMB, and one of the most effective tools for both the executive branch and the Congress in dealing with deficit reduction was caps and pay-go. They enforced an incredible discipline on every element of the government.
Let's cut to the chase then. I mean, I've introduced the only balanced budget in Congress. Our budget does this, and frankly, until you do that, you don't force congressmen to do the work we should have been doing all along, finding out which programs work, which ones are stupid, which ones are redundant, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. So it seems to me we should have some kind of cap. But I wouldn't say on defense, I would say on the overall budget, because frankly, as Mr. Lukemeyer pointed out in his questioning, defense is where we're supposed to spend taxpayer dollars. It's everything else. According to Robert Rector at Heritage Foundation, it's the 71 different means-tested social welfare programs we have, which when you add state dollars and tax dollars from the state and federal, actually are more than national defense. So there's a whole host of areas we should be focused on. How many on the panel would support a overall spending limit? Some percentage of GDP would support that kind of concept in our budgeting process. We'll go down the line again.
Yeah, you mean with regard to the entire budget, or with regard to defense, a cap?
I'm talking overall budget. I mean, it's
I don't think it's wise to start with the
$1.3 trillion deficit we have, the $13 trillion national debt we have. It's the overall budget. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we should ever go to deciding that any portion of government spending or government as a whole should be tied to any particular GDP figure. So, no, you don't tie it to GDP. You need to make a determination.
I need to go quick. Mr. Friedman.
Yeah, I support that, not indefinitely, but sure, this year, next year, yes.
Okay.
I would not support it for the overall budget for the simple fact that we have some things in there like Social Security benefits that have already been promised that are growing. Net interest on the national debt is rapidly growing in the budget. I think you have to spending is only one side of the equation. I think you have to also look at the other side of the equation.
I'm going to get the other side in a second if I get time. Go ahead. Mr. Schmidt.
I would support it.
Yep. Mr. Adams. Dr. Adams.
I support caps for discretionary spending, pay-go for mandatory spending. I would not peg any part of the federal budget, including defense, to a share of GDP.
What's the, and I know there are lots of things, but it seems to me the one thing we need, in addition to doing this, putting limits and going through the exercise and figuring out what works, what doesn't, and getting spending under control, the one thing we really need more than anything to deal with our budget situation is growth. So give me your thoughts on, I mean, I happen to, you guys probably guess where I come from on the growth side, but we need to have the right kind of tax policy, the right kind of regulatory policy if we're going to have economic growth. You talk about the years where we actually balanced the budget and started running surpluses. It's because we had sustained and strong economic growth in this country, and frankly, we're not having it now. And I would argue the policies that the Congress and the administration have been pursuing are making it difficult to get the kind of economic growth we need to deal with our budget situation long term. So your thoughts on that quickly, and then I'll be done, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think one thing for sure, looking back, I mean, I'm not, just not my area of expertise is sort of, how to feed productivity growth. But one thing we can say for sure is that much of the growth that we thought we had in the mid and late 1990s turned out to be a castle of sand, which we are now paying for through our debt. So we obviously need a different approach to how to feed and stimulate our economy than the one that was present at that time. It wasn't just a government question, right? It was a question of credit and wealth building in the country as a whole. It was built on speculation.
Thank you, Mr. Canetta. Mr. Frank, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing because I think, and I thank all the witnesses, we need a thoughtful, non-rancorous discussion about the appropriate mission. And I thank all the panelists for the spirit in which we have it. That's the key issue. What should we be doing? What's the policy we should be setting? And we have not had that conversation, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for providing this forum for this continuing conversation. I did want to just add one thing. I know there was a question raised about who served in the military. I think we ought to be very clear. I mean, let me volunteer. I did not serve in the military. I wasn't wanted. I actually did try to line myself in once, but they didn't need me at the time in 1960, and then subsequently, but I guess I have no point in trying to go where you're not wanted. But the question of whether or not you served in the military is very relevant to how we should conduct military operations. It is not relevant to whether we should conduct particular operations. That's what this is about. The mission is not about how you fight a war. When we do put our people into war, then I want to be guided by their judgments, and I want to give them all that we can. That's why war is very expensive for us, because you don't send our young people into war. All of us here on this rostrum have had the terrible experience of going to a funeral of a young man or woman killed in these wars, and so that means you spend it. But whether or not you get involved, no, that's not a matter of military expertise. We honor the military's expertise when they get engaged. Secondly, I would say this, and to Dr. Schmidt, I was a little surprised to hear you say that one of the big arguments for this is that's the way it's always been, or for a long time, that there's been a bipartisan consensus. Frankly, I had thought of the American Enterprise Institute as being somewhat more transformational in its approach. The notion that because we'd always done this in a bipartisan way is one argument for continuing to do it, I think is mistaken. It would certainly argue against your suggestion that we that we seriously alter entitlement policy. Social Security has an equally long bipartisan history, and no one I know thinks that, frankly, I mean, I think that's the kind of argument people throw in that doesn't really motivate them, whether that's the way it's always been. But I would ask you, Dr. Schmidt, in terms of your view that the military has been denied funding it should have ideally gotten, what in the last 10 years or so would be examples of where we were unable to accomplish a valid national security goal because we got the military resources to do it?
I think we've been able to accomplish those goals, but it's been extremely close run. Let me give you an example when it comes to, for example, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
All right, well, I appreciate it, but you suggested to me that there was a shortfall, so now I guess
if I can...
Yes?
Excuse me. There is a shortfall, which others can talk to here as well as I can. There is a shortfall in recapitalizing...
Okay, but I asked you a specific question, so we've paid no price for that yet.
We've paid no price for that yet.
I would say, in my view, yeah, I could find some resources. The Iraqi situation, frankly, I think it almost it doesn't honor fully the military goal. I'm told we're going to keep 50,000 troops in there, but they're not going to be combat troops. Well, first of all, I think there's some fudging there, because they do, I think, shooting and being shot at. I don't know how you define combat, and it does seem to me the people there are doing that, but continuing to keep people there makes no sense to me. So, but that's an example. If you leave the mission as it is, then you can argue for more. I also wanted to comment on another very important point that was made, that Gordon Adams made and others. And here I think some of my liberal friends may be a little bit inconsistent in overemphasizing the extent to which you can reduce spending by simply getting rid of fraud, waste, and abuse. There has never been a budget item I've seen that said fraud, waste, and abuse, which you could zero out. We talk about fat. Metaphors mislead us. Yes, there is fat in every human enterprise, and especially in some public enterprises, but it's not layered, it's marbled. You can't just slice it off at the edges. It's deeply involved. And that's why I do believe that the most effective way to enforce efficiency is to put limits on spending, not flat caps, but to let people know there were limits. Because imposing efficiency from the outside is very difficult. Incentivizing efficiencies from within is what happens. I think one of our problems has been that the Pentagon has in general, and the National Security Establishment has in general been less subject to budgetary discipline, and because less subject to budgetary discipline, less efficient. But just one last question, again for Dr. Schmidt. I think we are overextended. I would ask you to evaluate, because clearly the missions you talk about, oil from the Persian Gulf, it doesn't just come to the U.S. In fact, we get more of oil, I think, from some other places. Do you believe that our wealthy Western European allies are contributing sufficiently to the common purposes that we have?
No. But
Well, what can we do to do that? See, I think here's the problem. I agree with that. Well, no is a very good answer. You need, not everybody has to hedge everything around here. But the point is this. I think we are the enablers of that. There was a very interesting article in the New York Times a month ago about how the Europeans were able to afford more in some areas of their budget because we carry them. What would you think we should do if you agree that they're not doing enough? Is there anything we can do to get them to do more? Because clearly if they did more, couldn't we do less?
Yeah, we could do less, but I would add that they're doing quite a bit. There are tens of thousands of Allied troops in Afghanistan that if
Excuse me, how many troops, how many NATO non-American troops are in Afghanistan?
35,000, 40,000?
Compared to what of us?
50,000 now, we'll be up
Right,
to 100.
I think, and in Iraq?
In Iraq, well, originally, about a third of the force.
Yeah, and originally, but you said first that you don't think they were doing enough.
No, let me be clear. Yes, the Allies could do more. I have my doubts that if we reduce our posture in the world and reduce our own budget substantially, as the task force suggests, that will in fact get more from our allies.
All right, well, let me ask you that, though, because I think that's very, I mean, what do you know that they don't know? After all, excuse me, I'm going to phrase this question. There is, you say, a common purpose with our European allies. There are missions that have to be accomplished, fighting terrorism, although, I wish you could fight terrorism with nuclear submarines, because then we'd win, because we got more nuclear submarines than they got. Unfortunately, I don't think that much of what we spend helps us. I don't think the political problem is a lack of ordnance, a lack of weaponry. But given that they have the same interests we have, why, if we did a little less, would they not do more? Would they say, oh, well, Persian Gulf can't get the ships out, tough? I mean, why would they not be incentivized if we stopped carrying them to do some more?
There are free rider problems with the Allies, but it's not as severe as sometimes people say. I repeat that if we cut back our forces, it's not as though they're, because of their own budget, the way they've handled their own budgets, towards which we are heading, they have less flexibility for actually increasing defense.
Why, are they dumb?
No,
would they endanger the shipping lanes, the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Morocco, whatever that I hear about? I mean, why, are they suicidal, the Europeans? Why would they not want to defend themselves if we cut back?
I'm more than happy. Secretary Gates made the point a few months ago talking about the NATO strategic review, and he said, unless the NATO partners begin to up the ante in terms of defense spending, the strategic review won't be worth the paper that it's written on. I agree with that. I'm just saying.
Would you add a threat that we would withdraw somewhat from Western Europe to let them do some more on their own?
No, we've withdrawn from Western Europe. The amount of troops that we have there is fairly minimal. It's there for logistics and for use, because logistics is easier to go from Europe to Asia. I mean, Europe to Middle East.
Let me ask you one last question. Yep. The 15,000 Marines on Okinawa, which of course destabilized the Japanese government by insisting on them, I have assumed, and I think we should have sea power and air power available with regard to the People's Republic of China. Is there a contemplation that we're going to use 15,000 Marines in any kind of a land war involving the People's Republic of China?
No, probably not when it comes to the land war with China, but the expectations those troops are there for be able to be deployed in Korea, possibly in a conflict in the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere.
Well, the Taiwan Strait is excuse me, a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be with whom?
With China and Taiwan.
Okay, seems to me the notion that we're going to use Marines in any kind of a combat with China is ephemeral, and I think they're there for some kind of political reasons to reassure the Japanese, keep the Japanese from spending money, and I think 65 years after World War II ended, it's time for the Japanese military budget to become realistic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Frank. I want to thank you and Mr. Paul and the others who were instrumental in having this organization do the report that gave us such a good platform to have this discussion. Thank all of you for participating. I'm going to allow everybody to ask another question or two if they want on that, primarily so I can ask the one that I want to on that. One of the beauties of being chair, I guess. Can any of you, and I'll just go down the line, can any of you tell me the number of bases that the United States has overseas, and consequently the number of military personnel that we have in those bases? Mr. Canetta. sorry.
I would say 873, but the number is probably wrong. It's an old number. It's changed a lot because of building in Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. It's a number to start with. It's also important to recognize that much of that number are really small installations. The number of major bases is much smaller, though it is growing. In terms of total numbers of people we have overseas, active duty military, it's in the vicinity of 350,000 divided now, not quite equally. More are engaged in the CENTCOM area, Iraq and Afghanistan. The rest are pretty much tied down in Asia and Europe, and that's just the active component. I think there's probably around 45,000 more reservists who are overseas supporting them. So all told, we have over 350,000 overseas.
Thank you. Mr. Friedman.
Well, I was going to please Congressman Frank and just say no. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, and he knows more than me.
That's
I
acceptable.
don't have the number.
Dr. Schmidt? Dr. Adams?
What Dr. Canetta said is about the right number.
I asked that question because we've been working for about 8 months now with the Department of Defense trying to get those answers, and they don't have them.
Right.
So it's interesting that you can tell me a number of bases you think of the number of personnel, because we've gone around and around in charts and paths. If we could bring it up here and unwind it, paper to the wall.
I can only
with the
tell you a
different
wrong
computer
number.
outlets on that, because it starts with what it is the definition of is. Right. All right, what's a base? You know, like, is it the installation, all the installation satellite? The number of countries that they're in is astounding. In some of those countries, I think it would be an interesting topic to find out what the heck is our national security interest in having troops on a base in that particular location. It's a conversation we want to have on this group, but it's one that's very difficult to start until you get the facts on that, and the facts are so difficult to get from the entity that should have them, should disturb us all on that. It makes you wonder how they can budget and control for those people and those bases and those materials that are in all of those places. Dr. Adams, did you want to say something? Did you? No? Okay. On that, and so I think that's part of it. All of this theory that we're talking about is very interesting, and Dr. Schmidt, I was interested in the colloquy between you and Mr. Frank, but part of it would be much better informed if we really knew how many bases were overseas and where they were. It'd be fair to you and fair to Mr. Frank to actually have a discussion and be able to point out, well, this one has some significance and this one doesn't on that. But the fact that we can't even begin to identify where all these people are and then try to figure out what is their impact on our national security interest and how do they play into it and are they essential or not, is sort of incredible on that. Mr. Flake? Do any of you have any comments that you want to make as we wrap this up? Something you want to leave us with that we may not have covered and should have got into or gone into in more depth? I'll start and go left to right if it's all right with you, Mr. Friedman. Mr. Canetta.
I wanted to underscore what I think is probably the small amount but real amount of consensus that we've expressed as a panel. I think we all agree that it is worthwhile going after problems of waste and trying to improve the efficiency of the Pentagon. I think we all agree that's important. I think we also all agree that it's relatively small peanuts, that if you're looking for big savings, it becomes a question of affecting missions and structures, though we obviously don't all agree that that would be a wise thing to do. This pertains especially to Secretary Gates's efforts now to achieve as much as $100 billion savings from reductions in infrastructure and efficiency. It may cast some doubt on whether that's possible. But I think we have identified the notion that if you really want to have big savings, it's going to have to be structured, though we don't all agree that that's a thing to do. One step forward, possibly, for our thinking in that area is this. We all know what the input is to our military machine. It's dollars. But we seldom speak in terms of what the output is. We sometimes say that the output is structure, by which we mean tactical units. Or we might, as a proxy for that, say the output is trained individuals. But actually, that's not the output in either case. The real output is military power. And if we pay attention to the change in our military power, which is not a question of how many ships we have, how many people or planes we have, it really is a more complicated equation than that. I think we would conclude that, in fact, our military is much more powerful today, although considerably smaller, than it was during the end of the Cold War. And that may help our thinking about can we reduce and where can we reduce.
Just two small points. Dr. Schmidt mentioned a couple times the $300 billion in cuts that came from procurement programs that Secretary Gates canceled. That's true, but those programs were mostly replaced with other programs. So while there was savings, they went right back into other procurement for the most part. And in this year, the procurement budget rose significantly. So it's not as if we've been cutting the procurement budget. We have not. And then secondly, just with regard to this question, you never served in the military. Sure, I never served, but when I talk to people from the military, I get the sense that they kind of like the idea of doing less and having achievable missions rather than really difficult nation-building goals. So I think there's actually a large well of support within the military for the kind of thing that I was talking about in my testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison?
I would just add that I did serve in the military. I don't know that it qualifies me any more to speak about these matters than the other gentleman at this table. But my final note, I would just caution that as we are going through this, budget situation over the next several years, we do run the risk of optimizing our force for the wrong type of conflict. Right now, Secretary Gates has put a lot of emphasis on optimizing the force for counterinsurgency warfare. We run the risk that 10 years from now, once we're out of Iraq, Afghanistan, that the nation is not likely to want to get into a situation like that for a long time. We may have a military that's optimized for the wrong type of conflict.
Thank you. If I just interrupt for 1 second, Mr. Harrison, I think you hit something on the head there. I constantly ask the question about whether or not this administration or the last administration or any of these people that promote the counterinsurgency theory are intent on doing that in Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, the Maghreb, or any of the other area on that. Is that their intention goal? And that's one of the things that we have to look at. I think Dr. Adams mentioned that. Dr. Schmidt?
Well, certainly you should look at it. I mean, I actually think we've been fairly discreet in some cases. I mean, we have not jumped into every, conflict or every place of instability. I think actually some of the military has done a pretty good job of prioritizing where they've got to be. I would just two points. One is, and this could be sort of read different ways, but I think the report, when you actually look at it, is probably more sanguine from my point of view about after these wars about the Middle East, and it's more sanguine about the military balance in East Asia than I would be comfortable with. I think the trend lines in East Asia are not good. It's something that we're going to have to deal with, and it's going to be costly to deal with it because the way to deal with it, because it's the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, are fairly significant and costly platforms. So again, I think Todd's right. There's an emphasis on today's wars. Maybe that's what has to be done. But there's stuff coming down the road that's going to be difficult for us to deal with. The second thing is, I would say that there's kind of an expectation that Iraq and Afghanistan are these one-offs and that we won't be doing that in the future. That may be the case, and maybe we will decide that is the case. But I would just say that both Democrat and Republican administrations have been involved in wars in the Middle East now for 20 years. And so I would say that if history tells us anything, the likely trend line is that we're not going to be out of that area anytime soon.
As in, we never learn, I guess. Dr. Adams?
4 points, I think. One, I congratulate you on going down this road because it tries to marry up the problems that we have economically at home and in terms of the federal budget with how we approach our national defense. Number two, as we go down that road, as you and Congress go down that road, dealing with the reality that to get an agreement, everything has to be on the table is a good principle. Number three, efficiencies clearly are not enough, and I think you have a fair amount of consensus on the panel in that regard, that efficiencies aren't going to get it, and Secretary Gates' ambition right now probably falls short of what you're going to have to deal with. And fourthly, I want to underline that the discussion that we have on this issue, and it's understandable because it's the subject of this particular hearing, all too often falls into the box of saying, what should the military be? What should the military do? How should the military behave? We don't often enough have conversations about what are the purposes of American statecraft and what is the role of the military in that broader engagement globally in dealing with a broader set of challenges. I heard Dr. Schmidt say just a moment ago, and maybe he misspoke, but to say the military does a pretty good job of prioritizing where it should be. Well, it's not the military's job to prioritize where it should be. It is the national security policy apparatus, the White House, the Congress, the civilian agencies, all of whom need to be engaged in that decision. And ultimately, it's the Congress and the President's decision about where the military should be engaged or not engaged. I dig his principle, though. There's lots of areas where we don't have a stake. And defining policies as we've defined them today puts us at risk of being in areas where we don't have a stake. And I wouldn't use Afghanistan and Iraq as the proxy here for what else we may do. In both cases, those were wars of choice. Those were not necessary interventions. They were wars of choice. Right? We chose to go in and remove a regime in Afghanistan. And you can support it or disagree with it, but it was a choice. We chose to go in and depose a regime in Iraq. And in both cases, we ended up inheriting responsibilities for a whole array of functions that we've asked the military to do. And I think it's very debatable that we're going to go into those kinds of situations again any point in the near future.
I would hope so. I would hope it's debatable on that. Interestingly enough, we had a conference not too long ago about Northern Africa, Algeria and Libya and Morocco and places like that. And one of the general consensus, these were members of the Senate and the House and both parties, the real question at the end became, what's our interest there? And I don't think we asked that question enough. What's our interest there, and who else might have an interest that ought to be taking a lead as opposed to us, so that we don't have to do that everywhere all the time. Let me again just say how much I appreciate all of your written testimony and your time spent here and your expertise today. I think you've helped us embark on a conversation that I hope continues. I think it's a valuable one for us to have. I hope it bleeds into some of the other committees, both here and in the Senate on that, and the American public. I think it's important. So thank you very, very much. Meeting adjourned.